before the flood, before Noah built his ark, before God decided to wipe the earth clean and start again. Before all of that, something happened on this planet so catastrophic, so terrifying, so fundamentally wrong, that God himself looked down at what had been created and decided it all had to be destroyed. It's not because of human sin alone. It's because of what had been born from it. They were called the Nephilim, and they were not fully human. Genesis 6:2-4. 4 words that have haunted theologians, historians, and researchers for thousands of years. The Nephilim were on the earth. That's it. That's all the Bible gives you. 4 words, no explanation, no context, no description of what they looked like, where they came from, how many there were, or what happened to them. Just the Nephilim were on the earth. 8. But scattered across ancient texts, buried in manuscripts that were almost destroyed, hidden in archaeological discoveries that mainstream history has struggled to explain, a very different picture emerges. Picture of beings so large, so powerful, and so terrifying that the sight of them made trained soldiers weep like children. A picture of a race that consumed everything in its path. The animals, the crops, the people, and when there was nothing left to consume, turned on each other. A picture of a world so corrupted, so beyond redemption, that the only solution was water. Endless, rising, unstoppable water. This is the story of the Nephilim. And it begins not on earth, but in heaven. To understand Nephilim, you have to go back further than Genesis. You have to go back to a moment that the Bible mentions only briefly, but that the book of Enoch, the ancient text we covered in a previous video, describes in extraordinary detail. In the earliest days of human civilization, a group of divine beings called the Watchers were assigned to observe humanity. They were angels, celestial beings of enormous power, created to serve God and watch over his creation from above. But something went wrong. The book of Enoch, chapter 6, describes the moment with a precision that is almost unbearable in its implications. 200 of these watchers looked down at the daughters of men, human women, and they wanted them, not as spiritual beings observing from a distance. They wanted them the way a man wants a woman. And they made a decision that would change the course of human history forever. Their leader was named Semyaza, on the summit of a mountain called Hermon, a mountain that still exists today. Sitting on the border between modern Syria and Lebanon, 200 divine beings made a pact. They swore an oath together. They would descend to earth. They would take human wives. And whatever consequences followed, they would face them together. That oath was the beginning of everything. The Watchers descended. They took human women as wives, and those women became pregnant. What grew inside them was not human. The book of Enoch describes the offspring in terms that are almost impossible to process. They were giants, not large men, not unusually tall people. Giants. The text says their height was 3,000 ells, a measurement that, even accounting for ancient exaggeration, suggests beings of truly monstrous proportions. The Book of Giants, another ancient text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes them in even more visceral terms. They consumed everything. They turned the earth into a wasteland. They drank blood. When the food ran out, they ate each other. These were the Nephilim. The word itself is ancient Hebrew. Scholars debate its precise meaning. Some say it comes from the root naphal, meaning to fall, making them the fallen ones, the offspring of those who fell from their divine station. Others translate it as giants. Others are still those who cause others to fall, destroyers. Every translation points to the same thing, something that does not belong, something that should not exist, something that broke the boundary between the divine and the human and produced a horror that the earth had never seen before and was never meant to see. Now here is where the story gets even more disturbing. The Watchers did not only bring corruption through their offspring, they brought it through knowledge. The Book of Enoch lists in precise detail the things that the fallen Watchers taught to humanity. Things that God had never intended for human beings to know. Zazel, one of the chief Watchers, taught men to make swords and shields and breastplates. He taught women the art of beautification, the use of cosmetics, jewelry, and seduction. He taught the cutting of roots and the study of plants for dangerous purposes. Another Watcher named Semyaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barkijel taught astrology. Kakabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Think about what this means. Warfare, vanity, sorcery, astrology, the occult sciences, the manipulation of nature. According to the most ancient Jewish texts we possess, these were not human inventions. They were not the products of human ingenuity or curiosity. They were taught to us, deliberately, by beings who had no right to teach them. As a form of corruption so deep and so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of human civilization, we did not discover these things. We were infected with them. The earth was descending into chaos. The Nephilim were multiplying. The violence was spreading. The corruption was total, and God watched. Genesis 6:2-5 records his response in language that is startling in its emotional intensity. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Every inclination, it's only evil, all the time. This was not a world that had lost its way and might find it again. This was a world that had been fundamentally, irreversibly corrupted. The DNA of creation itself had been tampered with. The boundary between the divine and the human had been violated, and what had been produced was a race of beings, the Nephilim, that had no place in God's design, that had never been intended to exist, that was consuming and destroying everything in their path. And so God decided, the flood. But here's the question that every serious student of the Bible eventually arrives at. Did the flood destroy Nephilim? The answer, and this is where the story becomes truly terrifying, is no. Go back to Genesis 6:2-4. Read it one more time, carefully. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, and also afterward. 2 words, hidden in plain sight. In the same verse that introduces the Nephilim for the first time, the flood was supposed to be a reset, a total cleansing of a corrupted creation. And yet, the Nephilim appear again. After the flood, the promised land, standing in the path of the Israelites as they prepare to enter Canaan. How? How did beings who should have been destroyed by the flood survive or reappear on the other side of it? Right. The ancient texts offer several explanations. Some suggest that the wives of Noah's sons carried the genetic corruption with them onto the ark, that the Nephilim bloodline was preserved without anyone's knowledge, hidden within the human genome itself, waiting to express itself in subsequent generations. Others suggest that the spiritual dimension of the Nephilim, the disembodied, spirits of the giants who died in the flood, survived as demons, continuing to corrupt and influence human civilization from the spiritual realm. The book of Enoch explicitly states this, that when the giant bodies of the Nephilim died, their spirits had nowhere to go. They were not fully human, so they could not go where human souls go. They were not divine, so they could not return to heaven. They were trapped on earth as spirits, seeking bodies, seeking corruption, seeking to continue the destruction they had begun in the flesh. These spirits, Enoch tells us, are what we call demons. Now the biblical narrative picks up again, and what it reveals is extraordinary. Numbers 13. Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt. They stand at the border of Canaan, the land God promised them. Moses sends 12 spies into the land to scout it out. They are gone for 40 days. When they return, 10 of the 12 are broken, shattered, terrified beyond reason. This is what they report. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Grasshoppers. These were not timid men. These were warriors who had survived the brutal conditions of Egypt, who had crossed a desert, who had witnessed the 10 plagues of Egypt firsthand. Men who had seen the Red Sea split open before them, and they compared themselves to grasshoppers. The descendants of Enoch, the Enochium, were Nephilim, giants, and they were living in the land that God had promised to Israel, standing between the Israelites and their destiny, like mountains that could not be moved. The Enochium are not the only giant race described in the Bible. This is something that almost nobody talks about, the sheer number of giant races that appear in the Old Testament narrative. There was the Rephaim, mentioned repeatedly, associated with the dead in the underworld, described as giants who once inhabited the entire region of Canaan before being driven out. There was Og, king of Bashan, described in Deuteronomy 3:11 as the last of the Rephaim. His iron bed was over 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. 13 feet. Think about the size of the man who slept in that bed. There was a meme whose name literally means the terrifying ones, described as a great and numerous people, tall as the Anakim. There were the Zamsamim, another giant race, described as great and numerous, as tall as the Anakim, living in the land that would become the territory of Ammon. And then, perhaps the most famous giant of all, Goliath. 1 Samuel 17. The Philistines and Israel face each other across a valley. And from the Philistine camp, a champion steps forward. Goliath of Gath. The Bible describes him as over 9 feet tall.
6 cubits and a span. His armor weighed 125 pounds. The iron tip of his spear alone weighed 15 pounds. He had been defying Israel for 40 days. Not one Israelite soldier would face him. Not because they lacked courage, because they had seen what he was, and they knew what it meant. He was Nephilim. But Goliath's story reveals something even more extraordinary. Something buried in the text of 2 Samuel 21 that almost nobody has ever been taught. Goliath had brothers. 4 of them. All of them are giants. All of them are warriors. All of them descended from the same lineage, the giants of Gath, the remnant of the Rephaim. One of them had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. 20 for digits. The text records this as a simple fact, without elaboration or explanation. Think about what that means genetically. 6 fingers on each hand, a mutation so specific, so unusual, so far outside normal human variation, recorded matter-of-factly in the ancient text as simply a characteristic of this particular giant bloodline. This is not mythology. This is the description. This is the ancient historian recording what he actually saw or what eyewitnesses described to him in the same calm, factual tone that he records the number of soldiers in an army, or the dimensions of a building. 6 fingers, 6 toes. The Nephilim were real, and they were different from us in ways that went beyond height. Now let's step outside the biblical text for a moment, because the evidence doesn't stop there. Across the ancient world in cultures that had no contact with the Hebrew Bible, that had no knowledge of the Book of Enoch, that developed completely independently of the Israelite religious tradition, the same story appears. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian texts describe beings called the Anunnaki divine beings, who came down from the heavens and interacted with humanity. The parallels to the Watcher narrative are unmistakable. In ancient Greece, the Titans, divine beings of enormous size and power, were cast down from their heavenly position after a cosmic war. Their offspring, the heroes of Greek mythology Hercules, Achilles, Perseus, were half divine, half human. Giants among men. In ancient India, the Vedic texts describe the Asuras, powerful beings who opposed the gods and caused chaos on earth. Their size and power are described in terms that echo the Nephilim accounts. In ancient Mesoamerica, among the Aztec, the Maya, the cultures of Central and South America that had zero contact with the ancient Near East legends of giant beings who walked the earth before the Great Flood appear with startling consistency. Every culture, every continent, every civilization, the same story: giants. Before the flood, consuming everything, destroyed by water. The same story, told by people who had no way of knowing each other's version, using different names, different languages, different cultural frameworks, but always arriving at the same essential truth. This was not mythology spread from a single source. This was a memory, collective human memory of something that actually happened. But perhaps the most explosive evidence for the reality of the Nephilim doesn't come from ancient texts at all. It comes from the ground. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeological excavations across the United States, Europe, and the Middle East unearthed skeletal remains of unusual size. Reports filed by the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1800s documented the discovery of giant skeletons, some reportedly measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet in length, in burial mounds across the American Midwest. Newspapers of the era carried these reports as straightforward news items. The New York Times, the Smithsonian's own reports, local historical societies all documented these discoveries without the sensationalism we might expect today. And then the discoveries stopped being reported. The bones disappeared into institutional archives. The reports were reclassified. The evidence was quietly, systematically removed from public discussion. Some researchers point to a deliberate suppression and institutional effort to prevent evidence that challenges the conventional narrative of human prehistory from entering the mainstream. Others argue the evidence was never as conclusive as claimed, that measurements were exaggerated, that the remains were misidentified. But here is what cannot be dismissed. the pattern itself, the sheer number of independent reports from credible sources across multiple continents, across multiple centuries, all describing the same anomaly. Giant skeletal remains, giant burial sites, physical evidence of beings that should not have existed but apparently did. The Nephilim left bones, and someone somewhere decided those bones were better off hidden. So what does all of this mean? What are we to make of the Nephilim, these creatures that stand at the intersection of the divine and the human, the ancient and the modern, the biblical and the archaeological? Here is what the evidence demands we take seriously. There was a time before recorded history as we understand it, in the earliest days of human civilization, when something happened on this earth that fundamentally altered the course of human development. Something that left traces in every ancient culture on every inhabited continent. Something that was so catastrophic, so world-altering, that the memory of it survived in the deepest layers of human storytelling in the myths and legends and sacred texts of civilizations that had no contact with each other. The biblical account names it. The Book of Enoch describes it in detail. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve the evidence. The ancient texts of a dozen different cultures confirm it. Divine beings came to Earth. They produced offspring with human women. Those offspring were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and destructive power who corrupted and consumed everything in their path. The Earth became so irreparably broken that God destroyed it and started again. And even then, even after the flood, the corruption lingered. The giants returned, and the Israelites found them waiting in the promised land. This is not a metaphor. This is not allegory. This is the oldest, most consistent historical account in the human record, preserved across thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, across the most carefully guarded texts ever written. The Nephilim were real. And the fact that you were never taught that in church, the fact that Genesis 6-4 is read past without pause in Sunday school, that the Nephilim are dismissed as poetic exaggeration, that the giant races of the Old Testament are treated as fairy tales, that silence is itself a statement. Someone decided you shouldn't think too hard about this, but you are thinking about it right now, and that is exactly where the truth begins. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. They were here. The question is, what else did they leave behind? If this documentary shook something loose in you, if it made you see the Bible differently, if it connected dots you never knew existed, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Because the Nephilim are just the beginning. Every video we make pulls back another layer. Every story we tell connects to the next one. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. Subscribe, like this video, drop a comment below. Did you know about the Nephilim before today? What do you think they really were? We're just getting started, and the next video is going to change everything.